Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 already of our semester. The term is moving right along, and we seem to be hitting a good stride. So I won't be making any administrative comments in this introductory video. We'll turn pretty much directly to lecture, and I'll simply invite you to be in touch via email if you have any questions or concerns. Otherwise, just keep up with the discussion forums as you have been, and we'll move right ahead. As I get into some lecture material, my wife has popped in and put a Superman toy over my right shoulder, which I've left in place because I feel like this point in the term, we probably all could use a little bit of levity. I do pray, in all seriousness, that you have the strength, the resources that you need to continue to do well, not only in this class, but all the classes that I know most of you are juggling, work schedules, life in general, home life. And hang in there and stay the course, and we'll get into some lecture material here now. We have, of course, looked at some Greco-Roman and Jewish background to the Christian faith, and then last week we looked at the man from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, and talked a bit about the gospel accounts, the New Testament picture of Jesus, as this is bringing together both biographical detail as well as faith claims that reach into, again, that Jewish background and connect Jesus to messianic expectations, such expectations, especially as were current in the Second Temple period, evidenced in apocalyptic texts like First Enoch, which have a cosmic dimension to them. And so we have this very complex picture of Jesus, and the question then of teasing out a Jesus of history versus a Christ of faith is one that continues to exercise historians and historical research, and is something that I'll continue to lift up to you for your ongoing consideration, not only in this class, but in further coursework certainly that you'll do at ULS and beyond your time at the seminary. But as we come now into the 2nd century, there are really 4 major areas of development that we want to be aware of, and as you'll see certainly in the readings if you haven't gotten into them. And the first is what we would think of as really periodic persecution. Between 100 and the early 300s, about a 2-century time frame here now, we see the relationship between the state and the church going back and forth between one of semi-toleration and one of persecution and even martyrdom within the church, and culminating, as you'll see again, between 303 and 313 with a series of edicts, 4 emperors, starting with Diocletian in 303. We call this 10-year period really the great persecution of the church. But it begins already at the very end of the 1st century, in the 90s, especially with Emperor Domitian, who took the emperor cult and certainly had a very elevated sense of himself, and this results in some persecution of the church or anyone who is reluctant about confessing that Caesar is Lord. Incidentally, the reign of Domitian in the mid-90s is the traditional dating for the book of Revelation. And we see this, again, dynamic between the church and the Roman Empire in the very brief wildcard reading that I've put up for you this week in the letter exchange between the prefect Pliny, who is operating in Bithynia in Asia, that particular region of the Roman Empire, and has written to Trajan, the emperor, about what to do about these Christians as this sect, this new religious sect, is reaching into a variety of quarters in the Roman Empire, young and old, women and men. It's cutting across classes, peasants and slaves, up to including elites of various kinds. And so Pliny is unsure about what to do with this sect. And for context, of course, we have to remember here that the Roman Empire is a syncretistic empire, meaning that it has brought together a series of religious traditions, given its breadth and its legacy, of course, even broader geographic territory in the Greek Empire of Alexander, which stretched down into India. And so in the time of the first century still, or certainly into the second century, there are influences from the East that are present in the Roman Empire, Eastern religious traditions. But of course, as you well know, the Roman Empire reaches north up into even Britain, and you can think about the history, the deep history of British religion. We famously the Druids, the Stonehenge, and all of that. So you've got this empire with a variety of gods, and of course, especially its own religious tradition. It has taken on very much of the Greek tradition of the gods and simply renamed those gods. As I mentioned, then especially also the emperor cult, a certain veneration of the emperor for the sake of discipline, authority, obedience. And so because Rome is a syncretistic empire, really the emergence of any new religious sect is not problematic unless that sect is in some fashion denouncing the traditional religion of Rome, or in particular, again, the emperor cult. And at that point now, this sect becomes a obvious problem for the empire and the authority of the emperor. Now, this would be an issue with Judaism, but Judaism has historically had, in the Roman Empire, a tolerance, a toleration. Now, why? Well, this came out also as part of your reading material. We talked a little bit about it in the discussion forums. Judaism was not an international religion, and so it's contained, if you like, within the empire. And Christianity, as McCulloch noted, is very quickly an international religion. And because of that, its spread becomes much more of a threat, if you will, to the emperor. As far as Judaism is considered, obviously that history of toleration is not without its difficulties. Obviously, the Jewish revolt from between 66 and 70, and then a second Jewish revolt in the early 130s, 131 to 35. These revolts are defining ultimately for Judaism and the dispersion that will come of Jews outside of Jerusalem. But nevertheless, you do have a bit of a difference here within the Roman Empire between these exclusivist religious claims. It is the Christian claim that Jesus is Lord that raises a special problem for it, because as it becomes an international religion, the claim that Jesus is Lord and not Caesar threatens to sort of undermine one of the pillars of, again, emperor authority. And so we can understand then why Pliny would be writing to Trajan, and they're setting out this sort of protocol for how to deal with these Christians. And you should be aware that this is by no means the only letter exchange that seems to have taken place. In fact, about 13 years or so after the exchange between Pliny and Trajan, there's an exchange, there's a return letter from Emperor Hadrian, which is largely reinforcing the policy of Trajan. Some see that policy as quite difficult for the Christians, as quite unfair. Tertullian will later, decades later, reflect on Trajan's policy quite critically. Others see it as somewhat lenient. You can see in that letter that Trajan is not allowing for Christians to be accused baselessly. And certainly Hadrian in his later correspondence will reinforce that same idea. In fact, he is quite adamant that if anyone accuses a Christian without proper grounds, that person is to be punished even more severely than the Christian would have been punished. But nevertheless, here we have a framing then of this time of persecution between, again, the turn of the century, roughly, the coming into the second century up to the early 300s. And we will see some very interesting writing emerge now in the second century, the Acta Martyrium, the Acts of the Martyrs, including very famous accounts of Polycarp and Justin, for instance. So I hope to get you some of those as a wild card, at least one or maybe two of those as a wild card option, perhaps in next week's round of readings. But for now, I'll simply make you aware of them as you are entering into the reading material here for this week. Pause for just a moment here.